Do not adjust your TV screens. I'm not a tall, thin guy with a mustache. I'm Peter Lawrence with Novogradac and Company. Mike actually wanted to make sure I communicate to everyone here. He's really, really sorry. He sort of very unexpectedly had to return back to California this morning. And he wants to offer his regrets for not being here. He definitely wanted to be here. If you know Mike, he is very passionate about opportunity zones. And I'm not going to promise to be able to convey the same expertise and passion as Mike does, but we certainly have been involved with opportunity zones for a long time, and I'm happy to present here at NAAHL. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to give a very brief introduction. You can see the full biographies in your packets and your folders, but I wanted to quickly just introduce my co-panelists. To my immediate left, your right, Margaret Anadu of Goldman Sachs. She leads many community development initiatives at Goldman Sachs. We're very privileged to have her on the panel. I have my neighbor where we work in the office, George Ashton from LISC, who heads up LISC's Opportunity Zone work, as well as many other issues, I'm sure. And then to the far left, we have Kevin Rogers from PNC Bank. So really appreciate all of you joining this panel on Opportunity Zones. And my role to start, that I just was made aware of course, not so long ago. So please excuse my not so fluent presentation. But I'm going to give a quick overview of what Opportunity Zone Incentive is. And then we're going to look at some actual deals, because that's the title of this panel, right? The real deals. We're going to actually examine what an actual Opportunity Zone Incentive deal looks like and discuss that. Each of our panelists are going to go through some of them. And then we have a few sort of set questions. And of course, we'd love to hear everyone's own questions. And we're going to try to make sure we give as much time for that as possible. So let me start with the start. So we at Novogradac, I will never forget getting a phone call from Michael in June 2015 when Congressman Pat Tiberi said, I want to do something more than just new markets for economic development in low-income communities. But I also want to make sure I don't screw up new markets, and so doing it. And he sort of gave an outline of an idea of the Opportunity Zone Incentive, back then Investing in Opportunity Act. He worked with the Economic Innovation Group, who is, I think, the leading intellectual force and, I would say, advocacy organization behind the Opportunity Zone Incentive. And from that period, that bill shortly thereafter was introduced. And so we had the four original co-sponsors of the legislation, Congressman Tiberi and Ron Kind on the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and of course Tim Scott, who also was a very early intellectual and legislative force behind the initiative in South Carolina, along with Cory Booker. And that bill was again reintroduced with a few tweaks that we helped contribute to in 2017. And then it, as I think many people realize, it was actually enacted in the course of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the big 2017 tax reform bill. And in that process, of course, many features of the original legislation were stripped out. Since it was considered under budget reconciliation rules, the so-called Byrd Rule does prevent provisions that don't have a revenue impact from being included. And foremost upon that is the reporting requirements of opportunity zones. That, of course, recently Senator Scott and many others have introduced legislation to sort of put that back in. So that's the quick sort of legislative history. Many of you are aware of the sort of the basic idea, but I'll run it through what the Opportunity Zone Incentive, how it works essentially. Investors invest capital gains into qualified opportunity funds, and those funds then make investments in qualified Opportunity Zone business property and businesses But one thing I think we're seeing as we get more understanding of how this is operating with the regulations and guidance, it's really turning out to be more of an investment in partnerships with respect to both real estate of varying different terms as well as businesses. So let me go next, again, give you a quick overview of what the three main benefits of the Opportunity Zone incentive is. First, of course, is the capital gain and deferral. You have, if you invest by the end of this year, you get a full 9 years of a deferral. There's also the partial forgiveness of the step-up in basis. That's 15% if you invest by the end of this year, and if you invest by the end of 2021, you can get a 10% basis step-up. Essentially, the portion of the gains are no longer taxed. And then at the end of 10 years, you can get the basis increased to fair market value, and therefore everything that gains beyond that are free from capital gains. So those are the basic three incentives. And then here's our analysis. This is sort of trying to make a very high-level comparison of what the yield benefit is. For a standard business investment internal rate of return at 6%, what the Opportunity Zone incentive would do to that standard investment is, we indicate right here, essentially, depending on when you invest, for how long, that's the sort of the marginal benefit that the Opportunity Zone theoretically could provide. The next, I want to just quickly go over what are the eligible businesses that can take advantage of the incentive. New businesses, so rental real estate, of course, many in this room are currently, I'm sure, evaluating the possibilities along those lines. I know it was also very important to both Congressman Teabury and Senator Scott, the operating business side, which was certainly more challenged. It was back in the history of new markets when that was established almost 20 years ago. It's turning out to be the same, I think, dynamic with the Opportunity Zone incentive, where real estate sort of leading the charge, and we're seeing what we can do with the guidance and the regulations to help incentivize investments in operating businesses. There's also existing businesses that are expanding in an Opportunity Zone. Again, if you have existing rental real estate, renovations that you make, if you substantially improve that existing real estate, that can take advantage of the Opportunity Zone incentive. Or for existing businesses, operating businesses, that additions, existing tangible property improvements are eligible uses. And then lastly, also wanted to point out that existing businesses that move into an Opportunity Zone also may appreciate from the Opportunity Zone incentive. And that's also what was considered an important part of the intent behind the legislation. I mean, the Economic Innovation Group had done an analysis showing that many low-income areas don't have many businesses at all, period. And if you don't have that, you tend not to have the jobs, you don't have the investment that fall into. So it was both helping build up the ones that exist in the zones, to also trying to incent new businesses to move in those zones. Next, I want to just note what the sort of benefits that businesses are seeking from the Opportunity Zone incentive. First, it's you're trying to get a larger pool of equity capital. I mean, these tend to be, of course, starved of private capital areas, and having a wide set of opportunity funds that are looking to invest in those areas is one particular benefit that businesses are looking at. Another is the fact that it's patient. It's a long-term capital. A lot of market rate capital wants returns right away, and don't have the sort of normal timelines that the businesses in opportunity zones really need to be able to grow. There's also, it tends to be lower cost of capital. That's, again, one of the main ideas. It's not necessarily, it's a fairly shallow subsidy, so on a per project basis. It's not necessarily going to move the needle absent having other sources of resources combined with it. But lowering the cost of capital across the opportunity zone was clearly one of the main intentions behind the initiative. And then also it's the investor experience and sophistication. Many businesses in opportunity zones are not exposed to investors that the investors behind the opportunity zones, the levels of sophistication they have and experience in investing in a variety of different contexts. And hopefully, one of the I think intentions behind the incentive is to try to make sure that sophistication is transferred. And then, again, there's from the business's perspective as opposed to the investor perspective, what are the benefits to businesses? They, receive the tax benefits on additional dollars invested, and the elimination of the income taxes on the appreciation of the business value. I think I've got a couple more. What are the other benefits that we see? Again, I mentioned this previously. I want to emphasize again. It's really not. We're so used to in the tax credit world of finance of looking at a per project analysis. What does it take to get this one deal pencil? And I think very clearly the opportunity zone is not at all designed to do that on its own. It's I think the natural experiment we'll have in the opportunity zone incentive will be, governors had a choice of designating up to 25% of their low-income census tracts as opportunity zones. That leaves 75% that weren't designated, and we'll see, how do they perform economically over time in comparison to opportunity zones. If there is not a big difference, then perhaps the opportunity zone is not going to be so successful. But if you can actually document a difference between those designated zones and the ones that weren't, then I think that will be the real proving case of the zone as opposed to any one particular investment. And we've seen in the tax credit world that the catalytic benefits of a variety of different investments in a particular geography can be one other way we can sort of measure how useful the opportunity zone incentive will be in the future. So what are sort of the business qualifications that you would need to have in order to fully appreciate from the opportunity zone incentive? Typically, you're organized as a corporation or partnership for tax purposes, including limited liability corporations. You can satisfy a 70% tangible property asset test. That means at least 70% of the tangible property, real estate, machinery, furniture, must be used in a trade or business, acquired by purchase after December 31st, 2017, and used in an opportunity zone. And that was a key development in the first set of regulations. Treasury had been considering a much higher level, which was understandable perhaps in the real estate context, but would have been very, I think, a big barrier to investment and opportunity businesses. So enabling the incentive to work for operating businesses, this was a key change in the first set of regulations. And then the property for which the owner is the original user in the opportunity zone, or that the property is substantially improved. That's one of the key qualifications of a business in the opportunity zone. And a substantially improved, the definition there is 100% of the adjusted basis over 30 months. And that does not include the value of the land. So it's the improvement beyond the land cost. What other business qualifications? You must satisfy a 50% active gross income test. At least 50% of the gross income of the qualified opportunity zone business must be derived from the active conduct of a trade or business. This is a fairly standard definition in the tax code that comes with a whole set of regulations and guidance. There was a question that very early on whether rental real estate would qualify. I think that has been answered now in the context of the Treasury regulations. And then you also need to satisfy an intangible property test. A substantial portion of the property must be owned by a qualified opportunity zone business used in the active conduct of a business in the opportunity zone. And then lastly, you've got to satisfy the non-qualified financial property test. That means you basically need to maintain less than 5% of the assets as cash, stock, partnership interests, receivables, not from ordinary customers, et cetera, and so forth. Okay, so last thing, of course, you can't be a sin business. So that does not include marijuana, although there's plenty of, I think, congressional attention on this issue has been in various hearings where I think Treasury has made clear it's not their intention to facilitate marijuana-related businesses, but it's technically not a part of the code. This is a standard definition of eligible business, same set for new markets. You can't be a golf course, country club, massage parlor, hot tub facility, suntan facility, or other facility used for gambling. I wanted to also just want to make sure folks know we have a listing of opportunity funds at our Opportunity Zone Resource Center on the Novogradac website. It's not an absolutely exhaustive list, but it's a fairly, I think, a robust listing of a variety of different, both real estate focused as well as operating business focused funds. Encourage you to take a look at that. And then where are we with the regulatory situation? I did mention a little bit about the first set that was released back in October. And I think it was, we have an analysis of that. I won't have time to go over what's said there, but we encourage you to look at our blog that goes over that. And we also similarly have on our blog an explanation of the most recent set of guidance, which I think was really important towards establishing a lot of open questions, especially on the operating business side. And I think now many investors who had been sitting on the sidelines wondering how exactly is this incentive going to work now have a much better idea, and investments are sort of beginning to go forward as we're going to talk about. There has been some discussion about other guidance. We heard from the counselor to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Dan Kowalski, made clear that he doesn't think there may be a third set of regulations, but it appears in recent weeks that the Treasury doesn't seem to be too interested at the moment. And basically, I think only it's going to take the Opportunity Zone community to really sort of yell and scream for it, for Treasury to take that step. But we are potentially, there may be opportunities for sub-regulatory guidance to address issues like anti-abuse. I know there's many folks in this this room right now are concerned about that, and there are other questions of decertification and reporting. I talked about the legislation that was introduced along those lines, so that may be coming in sub-regulatory guidance. So actually, I'm now going to switch now to looking at some of those deals. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Margaret.
Okay, awesome. So I'll just give a little bit of context on the business that I sit within at Goldman, and then before I step into the two deals that we're going to talk about today. So I run Goldman's Urban Investment Group. It's a team at the firm that's been around for close to 2 decades, and our sole purpose is to invest in underserved areas for the benefit of underserved people. So as you can imagine, with the place-based focus, a significant amount of our work is in the real estate space. So we invest a little over $1 billion annually, nationally, but fairly concentrated in a handful of cities where we've been able to really go deep and engage with the local stakeholders. Of course, it's very difficult to do any real and true impact and comprehensive community development work if you are not closely ingrained in those communities to really understand what the challenges are so that you can be a part of some of the solutions. From a financial perspective, we're actually up and down the capital stack. So obviously our private equity practice is most relevant as we think about opportunity zones, but we also do invest in various lending products, so acquisition loans, construction loans, mini perms, mezz, et cetera, and then the full suite of tax credit products. So, Peter mentioned new markets. We invest in new markets tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, historic solar, et cetera, and a range of state products, state tax credits. So our business primarily actually was founded, really focused almost exclusively around housing. I think we feel still today very strongly that housing, of course, is the building block of any safe and affordable and thriving neighborhood with opportunities. But then over our 2-decade history, we really sort of expanded to address some other asset classes. So everything else that you want in a healthy neighborhood. So great schools, access to fresh food, healthcare facilities, and more, I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had an increasing focus on retail, commercial, and industrial, just focusing on also creating the jobs that are necessary in those communities. So in the opportunity zone space, it's been an interesting couple of years for us, and that people have asked a lot about how opportunity zones have changed our investing thesis or strategy. And quite frankly, it hasn't really changed it much. So we've been investing a significant amount of equity in underserved communities, as I mentioned, for a long time. And so we've really thought about opportunity zones primarily as yet just another tool in the tool belt to get important deals done. We are, in many cases, in multiple parts of the capital stack, even within a single deal. I mentioned the full suite of products we do. And so this has been yet another tool to really just make deals work. I think as many of us in the room know, that when you're working on especially mixed use community development assets, given all the tools that are required and all the state entities and city entities, that piecing these things together takes time. And so this first example, Bedford Armory, which is an opportunity zone, of course, was really just the tool that kept this deal going when there were many sort of issues along the way. So I'll describe the asset briefly. Ultimately it'll roughly be about a 500,000 square foot project. It's in Crown Heights in central Brooklyn, and it's an old federal armory. So this was built in, I think, the early 20th century, and was basically given over to the city to control in 1907. Built in 1907, deeded over to the city some decades later, and was basically just vacant. So imagine a significantly massive kind of, building with just no utility in this really important and sort of, dynamic and amazing neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so city agencies, primarily New York City's Economic Development Corporation, and the housing agencies started a process, actually dating back to 2015, to really figure out, what are we going to do with this asset? What does the community want to see here? So ultimately, the project will include close to 500 housing units. It's a mix of incomes ranging from as low as 30% of AMI, with actually a set aside of units for formerly homeless, all the way up to market rate units. So the project, you can see it has 3 main buildings. There's the old drill shed that you see in the back left. That is actually going to be a massive community facility development. So it'll include a 6-lane swimming pool, basketball courts, multi-use field, and the level of community engagement about how that building was going to be used was down to the types of swimming classes, what ages they were going to serve, exactly, what level of hours would be, dedicated back to the community. So really, really, really deep community engagement here. And then in the building just in front of that, that's going to be 60 units of 100% affordable housing. And then there's a new construction component in the back, and that will include the market rate units and additional affordable housing units. And then also in the front building, there's also 40,000 square feet of commercial that'll be reserved for not-for-profits who are operating already in the community, and then a few ones who've started recently. So it really does address a significant amount of needs in this community, from the housing, 200 permanent jobs that'll be created, the sports and recreational facilities for the students. And as you can imagine, in a place like New York, with just where land costs have gone and construction costs, a deal like this it doesn't pencil. It doesn't pencil without, various sort of interventions from the public sector, whether that be tax abatements, low interest subordinate debt, tax exempt bonds. There actually will be new markets tax credits on the community facility. And so the opportunity zone equity here, and I think, Peter mentioned rightly so earlier that, it is at the end of the day somewhat of a shallow subsidy, but when you pair it with other tools and you're looking at a deal that is either going to kind of come off the rails because of the various needs you're trying to solve, and, I think we've all worked on deals where you think you're right about to close, something pops up, and then, it's another year or two before you can get in the ground. So this is one where, we're really excited. We started construction earlier this year, closed with the city and state at the end of last year. And so we're really excited and proud that this is going to be one of our first Opportunity Zone investments, because there, of course, is, what we think is fairly placed concern and criticism about what these deals are going to look like. And what are the real participation, what is going to be the participation of the community in terms of what the deal look like and how the communities will participate. And this is a project that was already sort of well embedded within a very, very, very robust community engagement process from various local not-for-profits, not-for-profit development partner, the community board. And so I just think it's a great example of how, Opportunity Zone investing can really be something that pushes the sort of work that we're all already doing. So that's the first one. And then the second one, another significant housing development in New York City. So this is the third phase of Hunters Point South, which is actually real credit to the city, which is a very, very large multi-phase mixed income community that's being built at the southernmost tip of Long Island City. It is actually not too far from where Amazon was going to go, and there was actually a lot of, again, fair criticism about how could this census tract have even been selected as an opportunity zone, given a corporation like Amazon could even consider locating there. And I think that one of the things was unfortunately missed in the media is that, one, this is an area that is actually, it includes one of the largest public housing developments in the country, Queensbridge. And so I think there was a lot of strategic thought from the city in terms of placing those opportunity zones there for that reason. And it's also the home of this multi-phase development, which I'll talk about our phase, but across all 5 phases, when it is done, it'll be the largest mixed income community built in New York City since the 70s, including over 5,000 units of mixed income housing. So this particular phase, and I think we listed our initial investment in the pre-development phase of $8 million, but ultimately it will be a $90 million opportunity zone investment that will deliver over 1,000 rental units. It's kind of what I call the flip of an 80-20. It's actually 80% affordable and 20% market rate. And then there's a retail component and community facility components as well. And this was a transaction where if you're developing a project that is significantly or almost entirely affordable housing, on the positive side of risk, obviously you don't bear much lease-up risk, but on the downside, even the smallest fluctuations in interest rates really hurt you because your revenue streams are fairly fixed. And so this is one that we really started to put together prior to the increase in rates, which of course has come down a little bit recently. But the opportunity zone here is what is really allowing the affordability to remain as deep, and actually in some cases deeper than what was originally envisioned even in the RFP process. And so from a financial structuring on the opportunity zone side, it's in some ways as simple as it gets, right? It is real estate, it is place-based, 100% of the tangible property is in the opportunity zone. We will hold the asset for 10 years, but from a sort of capital stack on the other side, this project also includes, tax-exempt bonds, low-income housing tax credits, 3 or 4 different subordinate loans from the city, a state grant. So it's a lot of pieces that we're putting together to make this deal work, but ultimately we're making it work, and we're going to deliver close to over 800 affordable units and over 1,100 total units in this community that is part of a broader redevelopment sponsored by the city. So those are just 2 examples. We focused on housing, just given this audience, but we are also working on, we've closed 8 opportunity zone funds on balance sheet. We're thinking about what we're going to do for our clients and third-party capital, but we are also looking at projects in the solar space, in the infrastructure space. We're looking at a couple of pretty exciting opportunity on operating business opportunity as well. But I do think that it is important for folks to remember that there is a role for for opportunity zones in affordable housing as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Can we queue up the next slide?
I need that.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. If my mic is working. Can you guys hear me? I'm kind of loud anyway, so it doesn't really matter if I have a mic. So my wife says. Glad to be here. I'm with LISC. My name is George Ashton. I'm the Managing Director of Strategic Investments, which is a newer group within LISC that's focused on impact investing and pulling the activity we've done over the last 40 years into that impact investing space. So Opportunity Zones presents a great, not to use the word again, opportunity, of course, to go after a new set of investors and sort of introduce them to the work that we've been doing for a long time. This is a picture of Jacksonville. We were just there 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago. A lot of travel these days. LISC is in 35 locations all over the country, and almost all of them want to start an Opportunity Zone fund. So I do a lot of saying no, not yet, to a number of folks, but we were down in Jacksonville and taking a look at some projects down there. We won't talk about them today, but that's where the picture's from. So this is just a quote from Maurice Jones, who's our CEO, just about our intense desire to have the community itself involved in the decisions we make about the built infrastructure in their own communities, and making sure that they benefit from investments in real estate, but also investments in businesses. And so we're actually being funded by a large foundation to be announced by the end of this month on really coordinating with the community itself to figure out sort of on a mapping the land and figuring out what usages or what facilities they want to see, and which, of course, are economically feasible. And then the meeting of those two points is where we'll actually figure out how we can develop additional projects in those neighborhoods. You guys are pretty familiar with LISC already, as I've been told, so I won't go through these. I'll go through these slides kind of quickly, but we have the national office, and I'm a part of the national office. I call DC HQ2 for the national office, but New York is the first spot. Not to be like Amazon too much, right? And then we have NEF, which is our LIHTC syndication shop out of Chicago, New Markets, Support Corporation, which works New Markets transactions out of Chicago as well, and Amito for SBA 7A small business lending. So the initiative of Opportunity Zones is like a blanket across all of this, where everyone wants to be involved, either with housing investments or business investments, et cetera. And so we're trying to coordinate that. That doesn't include all of the, like I mentioned before, the 35, soon to be 37 offices across the country that we have in the neighborhoods. Something Margaret said is very important, having folks in the actual locations where you want to build investments is important, not only from a community impact perspective, but also from a asset performance perspective, right? You want to know the neighborhoods and know the sort of development context in the areas that you're going to go develop. And so I think if I had to sort of pinpoint where LISC has advantages in executing Opportunity Zones, I think it's this right here. It's our local presence, our national reach, and then, of course, our financial sophistication that comes out of our Chicago shops. $40 billion in investments since 1979. We just had our 40th anniversary this year. Leverage, I think, to like 90 billion or whatever it says. I can't quite read that over time. AA rated, so we try to bring some financial sophistication to the table to make investments happen. What are we investing in? Across the ecosystem of what makes a community, right? From grocery stores to schools to sort of programmatic investments in financial opportunity centers to business investments, et cetera. And I think the clarifications we received in the second set of regulations with respect to business investments were really great, because now we can start to have more conversations about business investing. We'll talk about that today because this is a housing conference, but that's really important to us as well. We sort of did a backcast of our activity in Opportunity Zones historically, and not to no surprise, we've been operating in these neighborhoods for the most part for the last 40 years, and we've done about $2.3 billion over that time period in Opportunity Zones for investments that would have been today considered Opportunity Zone investments. The roles we play. So as a CDFI, there have been many questions about, well, what role can CDFIs play? Typically, they are debt-focused. Actually, prior to Opportunity Zones coming out, we sort of shifted over in two ways. One, to focusing a lot more on economic development. And the second is to focus on actual equity investments to support the work that we do. So we had a $500 million fund out of San Francisco with the Chan Zuckerberg Institute of Facebook for affordable housing in San Francisco. I know that sounds crazy. It's like 2 units in San Francisco, but we promised to do more than that. And then we had an effort out of Charlotte as well to do a $50 million fund for housing there. So managing funds, helping to raise funds. Thankfully, I'm a nonprofit, so I don't have to compete with anybody. So if someone else is doing it, I give them a thumbs up and I move on to the next city. But if they're not, then obviously we're there to step in and do that. And then, of course, we can support developers and lending products. Pre-development lending is really important in that space. And then to add to that, we have sort of market research and convening the neighborhoods to help them be involved in this process. Many of them are fairly concerned about what it means for their communities. Okay. On to the funds. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I brought highlights of one deal, but I'm not going to talk about all the individual deals. I think Margaret did a great job of that. I'm going to talk about sort of as an intermediary or a fund manager, how we're looking at our space or our position in the space, and then how we're thinking about investors and funds and the overall collective effort. So 3 categories of funds that we're sort of thinking about and working on, quite frankly. So the proprietary funds, we have banking partners that come out of our associations with LIHTC syndication and new markets, et cetera, who have gains from time to time. I think initially we thought banks would not have capital gains, but turns out they do, and more often than we thought. So there you go. Yeah,
here.
exactly, to the left. So we have a fund we're working on, I'll talk about in a little bit, with one of our banking partners, and that's what the proprietary fund position is. Regional funds. So this is where we really hope to create a big splash. A number of community foundations in cities, in and around cities across the U.S. have asked us to come and create a Jacksonville Opportunity Fund or a Milwaukee Opportunity Fund. And so finding ways to get really competitive capital at sort of the regional level, because folks care about investing in their own neighborhoods, is this concept of place-based investing. And so if we can find the pipeline and the projects, the mission and the money, then I think we can put together those pieces. So excited about that middle bucket. And then the third bucket, sort of national funds, we are working with a larger player in the space has a wealth management shop to put together an open-ended national fund for a national pipeline of projects in a particular asset class. I think in this case it's mostly workforce housing, and so that effort is earlier stage. Let me keep moving and I'll get to the actual funds. So this is our impact framework. I think initially I underestimated how important this would be to sort of our fund creation and drawing investors to our funds. I think there's a fiduciary responsibility that we take seriously in protecting the principal that's invested, but also for impact investors, being able to show the discretion by which you'll choose projects and also the measurements by which you'll sort of long-term measure your success in creating that impact is really important. So this is the sort of outline of our impact framework, and we think really there's 3 pillars. There's smart development, which we think brings to mind concepts not only from an impact perspective but from a financial perspective of putting the right mix of development in a given area. 3 high luxury hotels in the same neighborhood doesn't make any sense. Not that we would do that work anyway, but that's just a bad example of overbuild, right? And so you want to make sure you're being smart about your development. Inclusive development. So as Margaret said, and we are on the same page, making sure that the folks who are in these communities already will benefit from the developments that come to the community in a way that allows them to have additional opportunities to come up the ladder. And then finally, impactful investments. So the community facilities, community services, making sure you're working that into the projects wherever you can. It is hard to, of course, do a community facility that is completely community services focused as an OZ investment because there isn't really an income created beyond what's required to sort of build the asset in the first place. But making sure you work those services in is important. Okay, So on to the actual funds and investments. So the first one is with the banking partner that I mentioned. It's a $130 million fund for a gain taken in May of 2019. And it's a national workforce housing fund. We're defining workforce housing as 80% of housing between 80 and 120 AMI. And we're looking at projects that are 100 to 300 units, really across the country. It's CRA focused for this particular lender. They want to have that CRA footprint that we sort of meet. And we are already working through the structure. It's going to be a corporate structure in this case, so I think we can talk a little bit about structure today. They're going to do it as a corporation, not a partnership. And so we're going to be sort of a third-party fund administrator on the outside of the fund. And they're doing that so that they can have ease of disposition in case they want to sell it prior to the 10-year hold. And then in terms of the fund status, we're working through deals and scope agreements, finalizing structure, et cetera. Investor returns, I'll jump to that, 6 to 8% on a 10-year IRR basis. We're sort of sculpting it for...
That's net or gross of fees?
That's net of fees, yeah. And then they're sculpting it for, thank you for that justification. Yeah, they're sculpting it for sort of as if they were doing construction debt and et cetera, so that that's their average return. And then of course deals are in CRA geographies. The management team gets paid, we get paid on third-party fees. So our added value. So they needed to move relatively quickly to find pipeline. As I mentioned before, we are seeing a lot of deals across the country because we are in these zones already. We also have a lot of housing underwriting experience through our National Equity Fund group. And then, of course, fund management experience in the funds that we manage through NEF and New Markets as well. So that's the National OZ Fund for Workforce Housing, which we'll probably announce like late summer with this partner. We're already looking at deals in Charlotte, in Phoenix, and in Dallas. Next is a more local fund, actually. So for those of you that are of DC, this is a fund that we are launching with a mid-sized development partner, minority-owned development partner here in DC. And it's a $100 million fund. The asset class is pretty varied. It's commercial, office space, and workforce housing. There's a large project, small project that has a second phase that's much larger across the 11th Street Bridge. It's called MLK1 for us. But we did the pre-development loan on the project to help them acquire the asset and do some early stage funding. We are going to also potentially do new markets on the project. And then it's also going to be a part of this fund, the first phase and the second phase. That particular project is going to be all office space. There is a tech-focused major tenant taking up about 60% of the office space. And then we are bringing in a number of other mid and smaller sized businesses to take up the rest of the office space. The other interesting part of the project is the ground level retail office space is going to be with minority and small women owned businesses that are from DC, so locally owned in DC. And they're doing some creative financing with the tenant improvements to make it easier for those folks to get in and be in those spaces. So that's an exciting project within that fund. That fund is also doing some housing in Worcester, Massachusetts. So it's a Massachusetts DC fund between the two. And then in terms of the sort of investment terms and structure, 8 to 10% IRR was what we're shooting for, with a 2.5 multiple buyout at the end by the GP. The developer is going to buy out the LPs. It's more like a 13% IRR. And then the deals we located in DC and Massachusetts. We as LISC are part of the GP. We're a fiduciary partner. Since they were a mid-sized developer, we were able to come in with our AA rating and provide some comfort to their investors. We're going to be doing the fund management and some portion of the asset management with our affiliates. So the investors are comfortable with sort of the institutional methods that will be used there. So it's really, I'm proud of it because it's a way for us to not only create opportunities with the actual investments, but also to create some wealth in underserved communities with the development partner that we're working with. And the last one I'll go over is really, it's interesting. We did an acquisition loan on this project out of Oregon, Redmond, Oregon. pretty early in the sort of the opportunity zone legislation timeline. And this is going to be a ground-up build. It's 116 units, and they will all be between 80 and 110% AMI. And we are actually taking a slightly different path here. We're working with a broker just to basically place this asset in a single asset fund with an interested party. So we have a few early stage conversations, but this is sort of like our third experiment in the OZ space. And with that, I can pass it, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the transactions that we did last year and the model that we created. The first and foremost, I'd like to say that every single transaction that we at PNC Community Development Banking are doing is CRA qualified as either affordable housing, revitalization, community service. But we've layered on a guide rail for ourselves so that every transaction must be CRA qualified. And I want to talk about the deals that, but for opportunity zones, we wouldn't be able to, these deals wouldn't happen. Okay. We created a model that our lending policy allows us to go to 90% loan to value on an as stabilized basis, but 90% equity into a transaction is just too much. So what we did was we decided to come in with 70% of the as stabilized fair market value as equity and 20% as debt. And then we would like the developer to come along with 10% for skin in the game. Our equity is priced at a range of 3 to 5% on a preferred return basis, cumulative, and we're charging a 1% closing fee. And then also as an equity owner, we would participate in any excess cash flow. The debt is priced at market rates, and it is, the beauty of the debt is, first of all, it gives us a first lien position on the building, so no one can come in and take the building away from us. It mitigates refinance risk after the 10th year, so the debt is fully amortizing, so over the 10 years, the debt disappears, and on a $10 million project, we will put $7 million of equity in and $2 million of debt. The debt disappears, or is paid off, it doesn't disappear, hopefully. It's paid off, and so that we're sitting, if the building does nothing more than retains its value, we're sitting with a $7 million hold on a $10 million building, which should be able to obtain refinance capital easily to pay us out. Here's the first example of a transaction that we did using this structure. It was done in Sheboygan, and every time I do this presentation, I say the word Sheboygan, and I hear people mumbling it in the audience. So why don't we all get it out of our system now and say Sheboygan.
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 So this is a mixed-use building. There will be 66 apartments on the upper floors, and on the first floor, there will be a health center. The apartments are a workforce housing ranging from 80 to 120% AMI, and the capital stack is made up of our opportunity zone, which is $7 million, managing member equity of $1.4 million, and a PNC loan of $4.3 million. So our equity is 56% and our debt is 34% of the entire project. If we, and the reason why we didn't do the 70% equity on this deal is that the debt, the equity was 90%. The debt was not fully amortizing, so we had to manage the numbers a little bit to make that work. But the benefit of the opportunity zones is if we did this project as a $11.3 million loan, amortizing over 20 years at market rates, the traditional debt service would have been $971,000 a year. With our opportunity zone structure, with the 3% pref and the debt service on the loan, it cut it down to $557,000. That's a $404,000 in cash flow every year. The appraisal that we have for this project had a NOI of $772,000. So this project would not have happened but for opportunity zones. One thing that we learned really early on is that there are others out there that want to play in this space. Our fund is a closed fund. We're only using bank gains, but we do have, of the deals that we did last year, 3 of them, there was a silent investor that wanted to come along and participate in the project, which is great. They'll take benefit of our structuring and also our construction management. So there's value to having a bank or CDFI in as a lender for construction management or construction lending. The opportunity zone, the silent investor can come in, use their own gains, take advantage of the program, but they have to agree to be silent, because silent investors, we found ourselves in the middle of a situation where we had silent investors and we had the managing member both negotiating against us, so we found ourselves in the middle. And the other beauty of the silent investor is many projects have appraisal gaps that a project, this is an example of a $10 million project, but maybe it only appraised for $8 million. Based on our lending policy, we can't fill that $2 million gap. But a silent investor or a subordinate lender could come in and fill that $2 million gap that comes in, particularly in these communities where we're working, where cap rates are high and values are low, and there's more often than not an appraisal gap. Here's the first project that we did using this structure, and you can see that this was in Philadelphia, in the Kensington area of Philadelphia, and you can see the capital stack. We have the PNC Opportunity Zone investment was $8 million. The managing member only had $825,000 to put into the deal, so they didn't have the 10% that we were requiring. And our PNC loan was $2.5 million. They were able to find a silent investor to come in to take advantage of the program, but also bring another $1.5 million of equity into the deal to make it happen. Again, the traditional debt, if we simply did this as a loan, along with the $2.25 million of equity, it would have been $900,000. Based on the capital stack that we have here, the debt service was $575,000, so there was a savings in cash flow of $325,000. Again, without the opportunity zone structure, we would not have been able to encourage another investor to come in, bringing $1.5 million of additional equity, and this project probably would not have happened. Nice thing is this, again, is a mixed-use project, and on the first floor there will be a credit union serving the community, so providing some banking needs to that community. All right, the Chroma building in Detroit is a 9-story building. It's not in downtown Detroit, it's in one of the neighboring communities of downtown, but it's sat vacant for a number of years. And you can see the capital stack is getting more and more complicated as we go. In this deal, we have both a silent investor and we also have a subordinate lender. And we needed that to make the deal happen because of the values just weren't there in the project. Again, on the traditional debt service, it would have been $959,000, providing cash flow savings of $318,000 per year. And the appraised value of this project was $13,800,000, which is based on the total development cost of $15,675,000. There was an appraisal gap of $1,875,000. We needed the opportunity zone benefits to attract investors and also to help with the cash flow to make this deal pencil out and work. In this building, there will be incubator space for small businesses, which is really in the spirit of the legislation trying to help small business. So one of the tenants will be open space for a small business incubator. And again, like I said, I think that just is consistent with the spirit of the legislation and trying to help small businesses. There'll be 74 jobs created, some of which are construction jobs. 55 of them are construction, but the other jobs that are being created are full-time, either in the building operations or in the retail space in the building. And then finally, the first deal that we did last year not only included a subordinate lender, but it also included historic tax credits. So we are able to twin historic tax credits along with opportunity zone projects. It's complicated and it takes a little bit more time, but it can happen. This was a building in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania that was used as storage space by Lehigh University. It sat vacant for a number of years, or it was underutilized. Originally, the building was built as an ice factory back in the early 1900s, where they would manufacture ice for refrigeration in residential homes. The traditional debt service under normal structures would have been $691,000, and there's cash flow savings in this deal of $360,000. The original appraised value was $6,225,000 versus a total development cost of $875,000. So therefore, again, there's an appraisal gap, and but for the opportunity zones, this project would not have happened. This project was on the drawing board long before opportunity zones came around, but the timing was perfect that we were able to bring in the program, benefit with the cash flow, and also take advantage of historics. And I do have to compliment, this is a public-private partnership with Lehigh University, and their subordinate loan is very, very favorable, making this deal happen. They sold the building to the developer, but they took back a ground lease for 50 years. So this will revert back to Lehigh after a number of years.
Okay.
So I'm happy to respond to any questions.
So let's, if we can cue back the Novogradac slides, we have a number of quick questions that we'll start off, but of course, we definitely would be interested in the questions you have in the audience. So I want to start off. We've got them queued up here. We already talked about the various deals that each of the organizations sort of described what they're currently doing. In the context of viewing all the particular deals you're looking at, one question we want to ask is, what are the constraint and limitations and complications that opportunity zones add compared to other community development tools? Who wants to start there?
Yeah.
I'll be happy to jump in.
Okay.
It's a 180-day deployment period. Once the fund is created, you have 180 days to deploy, and that's a tight time frame for investment real estate transaction. When we first went out into the market looking for transactions, our lenders out in the markets came back and said, "Oh, we have all these deals," but we discovered really early that shovel-ready is a relative term, and they have to be able to execute their plan and be able to close within 180 days. And I think that's the deals have to be ready to go. And what we're doing in this year, though, is we're recognizing the gains on an as-needed basis, so that gives us an extra amount of time. So we won't recognize the gain until we know the project is ready to be financed.
Okay.
Yeah.
George?
Just to put a little bit more, I mean, I agree significantly about that, because the issue is, like, if you're using your own gains, which PNC is and we have to date, although we are going to start raising funds for clients as well, is that if they sell an asset and they think they're going to be in this fund and you don't start, it's not like they can unsell their asset and undo what they've done. So the issue of a timing lapse in a deal, I mean, is a pretty significant failure.
Yeah, the second set of regs, I think, gives maybe a little bit more flexibility. There's something in there about the cash received within the last 6 months is not necessarily a part of the test at the end of that date. So it does create some additional flexibility, but I would agree. There's that. The 10-year hold, sort of having to be explicit about having a fund that's 10 years long when most private equity commercial real estate funds are 5 years, right? 3 to 5 years. And also in thinking about the timeline, the 12-month timeline for turning over assets, right? So if you sell an asset within the fund, you have to be sort of reinvested within that 12-month period in order to sort of stay compliant. The last thing I'll say is sort of the idea of commingling assets. So in one of our funds, we may have some assets that are on mission, but not necessarily in OZs. And you can do that to some degree because 70% of the QOZB's property has to be in the OZ and 30% doesn't. But then as you start to sell assets out, you have to think about making sure you don't mess with that equation on your disposition strategy. So.
One other issue that one issue that we've discovered, there were a lot of investors that have pre-December 31st, 2017 assets, and the unrelated party sale works, but they have to be willing to give up a lot of the cash flow for the 10 years. And we're willing to exit after 7 years because in these communities especially, we're not anticipating large capital appreciation. So we may be willing to exit after the 7th year. That might help with the, giving up that cash flow. They only have to give it up for 7 years instead of 10 years.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to do before we move on to the next question? Nope. Okay. So are there opportunity zone deals that you considered but did not pursue, and why?
Oh, tons, most. I mean, that's easy. I mean, and I think, I assume certainly everyone on the panel and certainly everyone in the room, we have high standards. So we've talked a lot about impact, and of course there are not sort of specific requirements in the regs about community engagement or what deals need to look like. And I have seen more large, non-community engaged, sponsored by folks who have never even been to a low-income community than I even thought existed. And so we've had a ton of easy passes. I would say the other reason, and I think you mentioned earlier, just economic feasibility. I think when you sort of marry a 10-year hold with underwriting, compounded growth can do wonders. And so you can assume, 5% annual growth on anything for 10 years, and it's going to look good. So we've also just had to have a lot of pretty direct conversations with people about what a rational underwriting looks like and what you should assume about cap rates and growth 5, 7, and 10 years out. So a lot of the deals either don't have impact that we think works, or just fundamentally the deals don't work.
George or Kevin?
Yeah, I think as we try to really come at this from a community input perspective, the community wants all kinds of things, and a lot of them, like I said before, may not produce like equity returns at the end of the day. And so you can try to turn them around and add in subsidies and sort of switch the equation around. But if you can't bring the right resources to the table, impact investors do want investment in their community, but they also want principal protection and some small amount of return. And so I think that's been the toughest thing, is to say no to some things that we really wanted to do. But again, the concept of doing mixed use facilities where you can work in some of that stuff, like you can have a small library if you have some other housing that sort of supports the overall economics of the project, that's a better way of doing it. And then the other point that Margaret made is just developing, being comfortable with the developer, right? A lot of new people in this space. And all the complexities around the timing of doing the opportunity zone investment and making sure that once you ask the investor to make that gain, that you can actually deploy the money into the project that you promised. You have to really trust the developer is on top of their game and has all of their sort of check boxes checked, et cetera.
I would say our first rule is it has to be CRA qualified. There were many deals that came to us that were not. There were deals that came to us that were $120 million, and we're trying to spread this money around to all of our footprint, and to use it all in one market, spending $120 million would not be fair to the other markets. So we're limiting our deals to between $5 and $20 million. I'd rather do more deals than one deal, and the exit strategy is important. And not only do we look at the fair market value going into a deal, but we also look at what the value will be after 10 years or 7 years. And many of these projects have tax abatements that wean off. So the value of the project may not be there after 7 or 10 years because the tax abatement's gone and the property's not worth as much. So we've passed on deals in that regard as well.
Great. So let's go on to our next question. So what are the appropriate roles for banks, CDFIs, state and local government philanthropy in opportunity zones? Certainly we have a lot of CDFIs in the audience, a lot of banks in the audience. Obviously PNC, you've got a role with the capital gains, but we anticipate that most banks don't have a substantial amount of capital gains. What other roles do we anticipate all these various different participants in the opportunity zone space? What are the best ways we can leverage their sets of expertise?
So I'll start with the CDFI role. There was a paper that came out that sort of limited the role to, again, the thought just providing debt to the projects that go into opportunity zone funds. I think it really depends on, from a CDFI perspective, the war chest you're working with, like the capabilities that you have, and I think our job is to try to fulfill as many missing aspects of the ecosystem that are required to get these deals done as we can. And I also think from our own opportunity zone strategy, it's not just about only deals that can take opportunity zone capital. It's really any deal that can get done in opportunity zone that is beneficial to the community. And so we don't just have that focus of it must just be opportunity zone capital deal or we don't want to deal with it. It's just, what does the community need to sort of sustain itself and to grow? And in taking the tools, opportunity zone is one of those tools to sort of plug in and make it work. But we just try to fulfill, any number of roles that we can. I think the most obvious one is engaging local CDCs and local community developers, because they've been in these neighborhoods and they sort of know the landscape and they understand why there's not a grocery store there and there hasn't been one there for 40 years. And so you definitely want to, when you go into these areas, engage local CDCs to sort of understand the ears to the ground about what's being done.
I would say one role that I think has just been really exciting. I mean, on the bank side, Goldman has gains, so we can do that on balance sheet, but we'll also sort of bring our clients into it as we think about third-party funds. On the state and local government side, I've been really pleasantly surprised at the way that mayor's office, city halls, economic development agencies in cities that are smaller, that I think prior to opportunity zones maybe didn't have the reason or sort of the moment to really get organized around what are the investable opportunities in our city and our neighborhoods, and how do we package this together for different neighborhoods. So I feel like there's because again, you said it first, like the subsidy in and of itself is fairly shallow, but I think what's a real success that could come out of this entire initiative is just the dialogue around some of these communities, and some of it is just almost like just a sense of pride. I think there are folks who live in these opportunity zones, and certainly the entities and CDCs and not-for-profits who've been working in these communities, as you mentioned, for decades, just having a moment to really stand up and say, this is why you should be investing here, this is what you should look at, you should take a look at this building in this corner, and this is why it didn't work, but this is what we need to do. And I think that conversation, if we can get it to the right pitch, get the right folks educated, I think will be a benefit that long outlives, a couple hundred basis points on a 10-year deal.
I mean, some states and cities have actually developed their own investment prospectus, right?
Absolutely.
So that's certainly, I don't think that necessarily would have happened if the opportunity zone incentive hadn't existed, correct?
Yeah, I agree.
I would say we're all stakeholders. The banks, the CDFIs, the state and local government, the philanthropy are all stakeholders in these communities. We have lenders working in the community. We know the community. We know the developers. We know the needs of the community. But also there's CDFIs, the local government. You mentioned the cities creating their own prospectus. Erie comes to mind immediately. Erie's like the model of all the prospectuses that are being created around the country. And philanthropy. We're considering a project right now in Pittsburgh that has a significant amount of philanthropic contributions to make it work.
I have to recognize Kimberly and Kresge and Rockefeller for their initiatives on opportunity zones. Obviously, they're a thought leader among philanthropy on opportunity zones. There are others, I'm sure I'm missing.
Yeah, Sorensen, Prudential's Foundation. I mean, there's a ton of great work happening.
I'll just add two that are sort of a new role for us. One is, we put together sort of theories about why these neighborhoods are underinvested. It has a lot to do with the perceived risks of being the first to develop in these areas, being focused on other areas that appear to be more fruitful, et cetera. And we have these perspectives created that sort of high-level showcase what might go where within these communities and what assets are potentially available. But we're working with a large foundation on actually funding some of the early stage due diligence to create impact investment pipelines. Doing like the initial studies or the market studies and really partnering with developers to create 3 or 4 projects in a given city that are, let's say, developed to the 20-yard line in terms of the initial research. Because I think to say that in general in this area we could have housing or this industrial area we could have, a commercial building is one thing, but then to actually have done some due diligence to scope out, and create a schematic and understand the initial cost of that building and maybe the pro forma is another. So we're really trying to jumpstart, because I think what we're going to have pretty shortly here is a lot of money chasing not a lot of projects, and particularly community impactful projects. So we're working on that with a large foundation. There'll be 6 cities, and we're going to do 3 to 4 business investments and 3 to 4 real estate investments and fund that early stage work. And the other way that philanthropy or community foundations can be involved is in one of our funds, we're thinking about creating what we're calling an impact preferred equity tranche. So basically, investors to sit ahead of the general LPs, but to have a capped equity sort of return threshold in exchange for that. But because they're in that position, providing cheaper equity, almost like mezz debt, but equity to the fund, they can exert impact pressures on sort of like the impact covenants within the fund itself. So those are two other ways that people can be involved in the space.
Great. I want to get to our last questions and hopefully some audience questions. What lessons have you learned through this process? We're still really early, really. I mean, the guidance, the second set just came out in April. I think there is going to be a rush to try to make sure you get the investments done by the end of the year. But what are we learning in these early stages of the Opportunity Zone incentive?
Yeah. I would say, I think we've learned a ton. I think one of the early things we learned is just how much sort of you have to almost break muscle memory. I think folks there was all of these comparisons to new markets tax credits just because, similar place-based economic development tool. And I think some of the conversations that I had that were probably some of the most frustrating of deals that we would have loved to have made work but just couldn't is people really digging into the details of what the incentive really is. And we'd have these conversations where you say, oh my gosh, my project's in an opportunity zone, like I want, the opportunity zone money, assuming that it was gonna look like a grant. And I feel like some of that conversation has changed, just that there's been, more forums like this and education around what the incentive really is and how it can be better utilized. I also think that there was, especially I think until this last round of regs, so much conversation about exactly how the incentive worked and what gains you could use and depreciation recapture, et cetera, that I feel like there actually wasn't enough conversation about the actual pipeline and deals and what assets people were going to put in funds. And I feel like even in the last month or so, that conversation is evolving, which is welcome, because at some point you just don't want to talk about the rules anymore and just actually do a deal. So.
Yeah, I think that feeds into what I would say, which is creating simplification and clarity. Mm-hmm. We have 37 offices across the country, soon to be, and there's two ranges. There's either folks that want to fund stuff that just will never get funded and they think they know what they're doing, or there are folks that think this is super complex and have no idea how to even begin to think about it. And focusing on the assets, I think, is the answer in that. Focusing on the types of housing. One of the big questions we got from our offices, what type of housing deal could actually be funded with OZ Capital, and what does it mean? And I think there's lots of code complexity that sits really behind the equity investor as it relates to their personal tax filings and making sure everything's situated that way. But to the project itself, it's equity, right? And so you can calculate an equity return based on sort of the capital stack of a project. But creating that simplification is just key to getting the non-commercial private equity field, the impact field, sort of going, right, in this space.
I'll say mine to your last question, because we're almost out of time here.
Yeah. Well, before we do that last question, I do want to give at least one brief opportunity. Anyone have a question from the audience?
Pardon?
The panel?
How long will this program be open?
Yeah. I mean, technically, the last time you can benefit from the permanent exemption, I think, is like till 2040 or something. But the first two incentives, so the deferral and the 10 or 15% reduction, that's really the end of 21. So I mean, the benefit is perishing every day.
I mean,
That
I will
sounds so
say
dramatic.
that there is plans. I mean, we know that Senators Scott and Booker are planning to legislation to try to reset the clock. I mean, it wouldn't be a strike the dates extension. It would mean that, say, after you're investing January 1st, 2021 and further, you get a new set of clocks. And that would be the concept. And there also has been legislation to just extend the other program requirements past that time. So I anticipate, of course, you never know with legislation, and who knows how successful the investments will be, and that will actually play a part to that. But I wouldn't anticipate this goes away anytime very soon.
And if I could just take 1 second to respond.
Okay.
We're planning on doing them beyond, even if we don't get the extension of 1 year, we'll still do them. We may adjust our preferred return a little bit to compensate for that 5% annum basis. But we're also building a product that will be very similar to opportunity zones, but using other capital, that we won't have all the regulations and requirements of opportunity zones, but we'll still be able to provide debt and equity into projects around the country.
I am so sorry we are out of time. So please join me in thanking the panelists.